So, so I'm going to present on this subject from fiction to function. I think the name might seem odd, but it'll make sense by the time I finish. The myths and mechanics of intelligence. And it says intelligence, not necessarily machine or human intelligence. It's a slightly different track from the kind of presentations we normally have at Cisco. It's actually way off track from the presentations we normally have at Cisco. It might seem like quite a distant topic. It might confuse people. That's not my intention. I just wanted to help people understand how complicated things really are, because there's a lot of hype around AI and AGI and things like that, but it's much more complicated than that. I'm going to say things that you'll find it hard to accept. You'll say, well, I don't think that's true. And that's because you are inside the fallacy. You can't sort of step out of yourself and look at yourself. So I'll try and justify some of that. So we'll take a long walk around. For a while, we won't be talking about AI, but we'll circle back to AI at the end, towards the end. So this talk, this one, Fact or Fiction, is actually a follow-on from a previous talk, Can Machines Think Like People, which I gave last year, not in this forum. You can still watch it at this YouTube link, or if you go to that website address. This previous talk was about the philosophical basis for machine intelligence. And there I covered the philosophical arguments for whether non-humans can be intelligent, and we went through all the way from, Hobbes and Descartes, Wittgenstein, all the way through to, the early computer scientists like Neil and Minsky and others, and all the way through to Turing and Penrose. And we really drilled down about what it means to be intelligent and whether people are intelligent and machines are intelligent, whether that's the same thing. If you're interested in that topic, I do recommend you go and read that. It's actually quite a good companion piece to the talk I'm giving today. But today's talk is actually not about AI. Mostly it's about us, you and me, and all the other kind of, mammalians, really, not just humans around. And when people do AI, when they develop AI and when they research AI, sorry, I'll just switch my camera off while I'm presenting because of bandwidth. When they do that, they are inspired by us. It's bio-inspired. They try and take a precedent from us. So things like machine learning, neural nets, computer vision, these are all grounded in metaphors of sort of the way humans work. But the question is that a good route? Is that a good starting place? It seems like an obvious starting place, but does that lead to the best outcomes? Because if we're going to do that, first we really need to understand who we are. We need to understand ourselves. We need to understand more about how our mind works, and how our perception of our mind works might be different from how it actually works. And this, as we'll come up towards the end, has a lot of implications for the development of AI, especially for AGI, artificial general intelligence. So I'm not a neurologist and I haven't studied neurology, so I can't claim to have any original content here, but I'm going to present content from these three books. Okay, I'm one of those people who used to enjoy book reports at school, and I'm going to be talking about these three very influential and very important books, fairly new, all of them. We're going to deep dive into each one. They're different, but they're co sort of related. They're not about AI either, although the middle one says it is. They're actually about us and the way we explore, the way we experience the world. And we'll go through the key themes of each book. And then we'll think about what that means about our relationship with AI and what it means for there to be a co-intelligent entity, which is not human. I tried hard not to misrepresent anything in these books. So when you hear me talking about these books, I'm talking in quite firm language because that's what the authors are doing. And as I said, you might find some of the things they've said hard to accept. I can only present cursory evidence of their arguments here. Their arguments actually go quite deeply in the book, but obviously we only have a limited amount of time. And these three books are just one of many in my endless search for answers. Here are some of the other ones that I enjoyed. There's others as well if you want a reading list. Some of these are quite new, but a couple of the ones like Penrose and Bennett are actually quite old and classic books actually on the subject. So let's go straight into this one, The Mind is Flat by Nick Chatter. Now, what I'll do is I won't introduce the books, I'll just go straight into what their thesis is. What we call the mind is not a deep well of hidden truths, but it's just a clever surface. It's improvising meaning, emotion, and identity in the moment by moment, and it's making chaos feel coherent. Chatter's thesis is that we don't really have a deep mental life. We think we do, but we don't. And all those things like our stored beliefs, consistent preferences, the fact that we have a self that's unified, it's really just a clever illusion. And he goes through several arguments as to why that is the case. And he actually goes through it in some detail. And obviously, I'll have to gloss over some of that here. So I'll talk about the main findings that he has. First of all, he says that our thoughts are really improvised. The brain is just fabricating explanations, reasons, and narratives on the fly. And that actions are often initiated before our consciousness is made aware of them. So your body is taking decisions to do things. I'm actually moving my hands right now and sitting. My body is making decisions. And the explanation for that I'm giving to myself is a post facto generated explanation. It's nothing to do with the decision. The mind is more like improvisational theatre than a rules-based engine. It's a story that's being woven continuously, and it depends on context. And the way we can, there's a series of experiments that we see in the books, but one of them, this rather horrible looking picture here, is about a split brain experiment. So the brain is in two halves, the left and the right half, and they control different parts of the body. In some people, for medical reasons, not for experimental reasons, they have to split the fibers that connect the two halves. There's something called the corpus callosum that connects them. They have to split them. And when they split them, you actually end up with two independent minds which can't communicate with each other. And that doesn't have a terrible effect on humans, but it means that you can talk to one half of the brain without the other half being aware through techniques I won't tell you. And if you tell one half of the brain to do something, like will you go and close the window, and they will go and do that. And then you can talk to the other half of the brain and say, why did you do that? And with no connection to the original signal, the other half of the brain will always make up a reason which it believes to be true. It'll say, well, I was feeling cold, or it's a bit noisy out there, so I thought I'd shut it, or I couldn't hear what you were saying. The point is the other half of the brain isn't lying. If you put it on a polygraph, it's telling the truth. What's doing it? It's doing what the brain always does. It's post facto justifying to itself and the world actions that were taken by other parts of the brain. So the brain is just making up thoughts after the fact. And another key finding from Chatter is that self is a story, that your identity that you feel is really a retrospective narrative that is imposed from the outside. Sorry, someone needs to go on mute as well. So we construct a unified sense of ourselves, but we stitch that together by sort of improvising decisions that were made and pretending it's a coherent story. So the fact that you feel like a unity in the self is a story your mind is inventing for yourself. And people remember themselves as being consistent over time, even if there's dramatic changes in their preferences and beliefs, but it feels like you have a kind of continuity of belief. And there's lots of experiments to prove this. There's what we call choice blindness experiments, where people are asked to make choices about things, but then researchers secretly swap the choices and give people the thing they didn't choose, but they don't know that. And then they will go ahead and tell you quite bold terms why they chose that and why it was better than the other one. The choices you make are really being made at an instinctive level. And your consciousness generally is quite a late player, and it's like justifying it to other people and to itself. This is one of the most troublesome findings, that we interpret body states through contextual cues rather than having inner feelings. So you and I, we feel like we've got inner feelings, but emotions really aren't internal states. They're just interpretations of body signals that you've become used to. So your body sends out certain signals, high heart rate, sweat, and things like that. And your mind has learned to interpret those as an emotional state. But an emotional state is again, a post facto explanation of bodily signals. Our brains interpret coincident body signals as emotional reactions, just like your eyes interpret reflected light as color, but the color's not really there. And there's lots of experiments they had to show this. They put people into precarious situations, and then it's slightly odd experiment. They put this attractive person who was doing the questioning. When you put someone into a situation where their heart rate will naturally rise, or they feel, or their emotional state changes, they're more likely to report attraction to the female thing. Is because the emotional states are getting mixed up. The body is trying to post-process the signals. So in Chatter's view, emotions also aren't real, just like your consciousness isn't real, or they are real, but they're just post facto explanations of things that are happening in your body anyway. Preferences are unstable. Choices are context dependent and shaped by framing, not fixed by, not inner values. You don't have a set of inner values that govern your choices as much as the context does. We don't discover our preference, we construct our preference in the moment, and then we explain it to ourselves and others. And the fact that we believe we have consistent preferences over time is really part of a retrospective story that we're telling ourselves. And I don't think I'll go through every experiment. There's experiments here to do with base preferences and the way identical outcomes can be described to people. I don't think we have time to go through all the studies. This is a very important concept. Memory is generative. Okay, it's not a retrieval system. It's not a database of facts that you remember. It's generative. You generate the memory. We rebuild past events, not as they were, but we rebuild them to fit the present narrative. Memory works like an improvised storyteller. It draws on past fragments for sure, but it assembles them as it needs to build a coherent story today. So memories are being constantly backfilled in real time. They're not retrieved from a database. It's not a generative thing. Sorry, it's not a retrieval thing. It's generative. They are being shaped. They're being shaped as much by the present as they are from the past. And there's lots of experiments in false memory. You can easily get people to remember things that never happened, to make bold statements about things they definitely think happened when they didn't happen, just by sometimes subtle changing of words. If you say to, so if people are involved in a crash and you say, oh, when these cars hit each other, what happened? And then you say to other people, when these cars smash together, what happened? And when you say that word smash together, memories will change of the event. People remember things that didn't happen. That's because the memory isn't really remembering past. It's you trying to explain things to yourself in the present. And the final one, I think, on chatter is that coherence is illusion. The fact that you feel like you're a consistent creature making consistent things is really an illusion. Your brain is filtering and reshaping your experiences, your past, your memory to make it feel like a unity and a reliable, controllable things. Perception coherence is actively constructed all the time through inference and storytelling, but it's not something that's necessarily present in the mind, in the stimulus of the mind. And again, there's lots of experiments to show how people are thinking they're making a coherent and they are a coherent entity, but when you drill into it, you say, okay, there's lots of gaps in that and people aren't becoming aware. Because your brain is obviously telling a story to others, but it's a telling story to itself all the time. Because it's important for evolutionary purposes that you feel this way, even if it may not be the way your brain is actually working. So chatter gives us some really, so by the time you get out to Chatter's book, you're like sitting there thinking, okay, this is pretty heavy. And maybe my brain isn't working the way I thought it was working. Maybe it is. The whole point of the book, the mind is flat. Chatter's thesis is your mind is very, very shallow. It just feels deep to you because it's telling you a story that is deep and it's hiding the details of all the things that made it shallow. And just when you thought that was hard, you then hit this guy, Max Bennett, with his brief history of intelligence, and he makes the word even harder. So intelligence is not a single breakthrough, but a layered accident of evolution. An improvised scaffold of ancient neural systems stacked haphazardly into what we now mistake for reason. Okay, this is the best of the three books. It's an absolutely marvelous read. If you don't read anything else, definitely read this book. I love this book. I actually read it twice, which is very rare for me because I'm a slow reader. So Bennett goes through 5 different things that happened in building us as intelligent creatures. So we start with reptilian reflexes, just moving, and this was for all bilaterians, which is all creatures that have a mouth and a anus, as it were, and then move around. And basic survival, fight and flight, hardwired, reactive. These things happen very early in life. Then we got into reinforcement learning, associating signals with rewards and punishment. That led to adaptive behavior. Drawing on past experiences. But then things really, that was all mammals, by the way, can experience that. Not all animals, but certainly mammals. Then when we got to the primates, things really started taking off big time. Social cognition, understanding that others have a different view of the world than you do, theory of mind, social modeling, developing empathy and cooperation, being deceptive to other people, understanding and modeling other person's intentions different from your own intentions. So this social cognition was a very late entry in the primate world. And finally, then we got into imagination and simulation, which I'll go into some detail because this is quite this is a bit of a head scratcher as to the way our mind works. This is all in all the Homo families, all the early hominids. Simulating a possible future, thinking, okay, what will happen if I do that? Planning it, having counterfactuals here, but if I don't do that, then something else might happen. And having this mental time travel, jumping forward in time and then jumping backward in time. Predictive thinking about actions and consequences. This is very advanced behavior. This is what they call mentalizing. It's in all sort of hominids. And finally, we get to us as humans, logic, language, symbols, cultural knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the space that chatter is in. All the stuff we talked about earlier from chatter is in this block here. But I'm going to focus on these two. The first two really aren't about intelligence at the level of AI. They're more basic things. The last one we've already covered with chatter. We'll go into these two, and we'll talk about how the brain is behaving very differently from how you might expect it to behave. So social cognition is about predicting behavior, and it evolved in primates, and it's about having empathy and manipulation and cooperation and deception. And it's all about understanding that there is another mind, and that mind has another perception to yours. It's about understanding that what that mind sees and wants and knows isn't the same as what you see and want and knows. And it's very few animals that can make that link. Not even all mammals can make that link. And even children don't make that link until they're about 3 or 4 years old. And that's when they can start to lie to you and say, no, I didn't eat that cake. It's because they've realized that your perception is not the same as their perception. And the imagination, the next one up, the imagination and simulation, is arrived in early hominids. And this is where you do planning and anticipation. So I can see an animal I want to eat. I can go and get it, but I can see there's a predator. Is it far enough for me to, if I run, will I reach it in time, or will the predator come? That's me planning ahead, doing time assessments. Okay, what if I throw something in the opposite direction so the predator thinks there's something over there and that predator runs that way? Then if I run forward, will I have enough time to run there? And this is all simulation. So what you're doing in your brain is you're creating alternative world scenarios. And you're running through those scenarios in your brain, and you're using, as we'll talk about, a mechanism called valence to test those scenarios. And this is only present, as far as we know, in hominids and above, including us, perhaps in some of the hunting animals, but maybe not to the same extent. And this is where we come to a very important concept called valence. Okay, valence is a process which takes your senses, your memories, and your context, and it essentially returns a emotional response, okay, to that. And it's essentially like a black box function. Okay, it's actually run by a part of the brain called the limbic system, by a component called the amygdala. And what happens is you sense things, you have memories, you have context, it feeds into the amygdala, and the amygdala returns an emotional response. It says, okay, well, I'm satisfied by that food, or I feel aroused by this image, or I'm disgusted by what I see. And it's really just like a functioning computational sense with inputs and outputs. It's classic computer science 101. The key point is the amygdala doesn't know whether what you're telling it is real or whether it's part of a simulation. It is not aware of that. It's so deep in the mind, it's simply returning inputs, outputs for inputs. And when I said that hominids run simulations, the disturbing fact is that's all we do. There is no real world. We are not perceiving the world. We are simply living through a series of simulations of the world in our mind. Our minds, human minds, are continuously creating simulations of the mind, of things that could happen, and we are continuously running valence functions across them as a kind of search space to find out the best routes. So you might have lots of different world states. You might run a valence function. The valence function might say, well, these are more important and these are less important. The amygdala is the kind of vector of valence. And it's so important that people don't realize your entire existence is based around, your entire emotional existence is based around your amygdala giving signals back to the brain. But it's important to understand that, as I said earlier, the amygdala really doesn't know about whether the signals it's receiving are real or not. It doesn't know and it doesn't care. This is why you sometimes have a really big emotional response to something that didn't actually happen. You just thought about it, or you have an emotional response to things that you predicted that didn't actually occur. They don't feel any different because they're not any different from the valence system down. They're just the same. So we live inside a neural predictive simulation. The brain is not a passive receiver of signals from the outside. You're not receiving signals from the outside and saying, oh, how does this affect the world I'm looking at? Rather, you've built a world state, you've built a series of world states, and these simulations are running, and you're just testing the future scenarios all the time using valence. And your amygdala is the valence vector for that. It doesn't distinguish it between mental imagery and real. It doesn't care any different. It doesn't react differently. We can prove that. It behaves the same. And that's why you have emotional responses to imagined futures or remembered pasts just as vividly as you do to things in the moment. Your brain, when you perceive things, the feeling we have is that senses come from outside and we perceive them and we understand them and we update the current world state in our minds. That's not the way the brain is working. The brain is running hundreds of world states in parallel, and it's predicting what stimulations it expects to find in each one. And when the sensory inputs come in, what it's actually doing is it's adjusting its confidence levels to say, okay, well, that worldview isn't correct, or this worldview is correct. And it's not really perceiving the world. Other parts of your brain is perceiving the world. So that if something throws something at me and I duck, there is a kind of a more reflexive part of my brain that did that, but that's nothing to do with my intelligent brain. That's nothing to do with my cortical cognitive brain. Those brains are not living in a real world. They're living in a perceptive world all the time. Perception is not a window to the world. It's a testing tool for the simulated worlds. I did say some of these things would be hard to accept. The valence system has problems. It goes wrong all the time. Okay, like all evolutionary systems, it's always going wrong. And when it goes wrong, the results can be pretty bad. So addiction is when the system starts to overvalue certain stimuluses. It says, okay, this stimulus is so great, far beyond any utility. And it kind of like reward pathways become hijacked by a certain stimulus event. And the brain is treating these short-term rewards as high fitness outcomes, even though they're not. So you get this feedback loop where you crave more, you get more, you reinforce more. And addiction is an absolute sort of maladaptive behavior of your valence system. As is depression. In depression, your system has become blunted. So what's happening? You're losing the positive values of your valence system. It's called ehedina. All the future states start to look bleak because you're under predicting the rewards you're going to get, and the negative stimuli are becoming overweighted all the time. And again, this is a miscalibration of your valence system. And anxiety is the same. Neutral or uncertain stimuli become exaggerated as negative valence. So you're responding to danger even though you're essentially safe. And this leads to things like avoidance and hypervigilance and chronic stress when you shouldn't have that. And so all of these things really are problems in the valence system, and the valence system is going wrong. Okay, so if we've got through Chatter, who said that we're not really deep people, we're quite shallow, and we're just sort of running shallow algorithms, and we're telling a story to ourselves that we are deep. And then we got through Bennett and says, well, part of your brain, at least the intelligent part of your brain, isn't actually even living in the real world. It's just continuously running a series of simulations and using valence to decide what you should or shouldn't do. Then we come to Hoffman. Hoffman is a difficult read because it is off the chart for weirdness, but it's hard to argue against when you read it. What we perceive as reality is not really as the world is. It's just an illusion that we've created. It's a user interface. Natural selection has created it, not because it's accurate, because it helps us survive. And what's happening is we're hiding the underlying truth of the world around us because we can only look at things that we can manage. So the world as we see it is not the world as it is. It's a kind of a system that's been created for our minds to understand the world as it is. And that might seem weird. I'll try and justify it. He does it in 300 pages. I'll try and do it in 3 slides. Evolution prioritizes fitness, not truth. Natural selection doesn't care whether your perceptions are accurate. It just cares whether they enhance your survival and your reproduction. So a veridical system, a veridical perception is when you see things really as they are. You absolutely see the world as it is. And there is no animal in the world, even single cell animals that we know of, that has veridical perception. It's a notional mathematical construct only. Everything sees adaptive perception because in a mathematical game theory, if you pitch veridical perception against adaptive selection always wins, because veridical selection is slow, it's costly, you have to assess the entire world, it's maladaptive, I mean, it doesn't give a handle on for evolution to change things. Whereas adaptive perception, which is what we see, is very fast, it cuts down the search algorithms very quickly, it adapts very much. So how you experience something one day might not be how you experience it a million years later when you've evolved. And what we perceive is shaped by evolutionary usefulness, not by objective reality. So a good example of this is temperature. So when we experience temperature, we experience cold and hot in a certain way, but that concept of temperature is only in our minds. It doesn't actually exist. What actually exists is vibration. The atoms are vibrating at different speeds. Temperature is simply a mental state. It's not an actual physical part of reality, nor is color, by the way. Color is also just a perception that we have. This whole theory is called fitness beats truth, or FBT theory. It's not, by the way, it's not just that Hoffman's, this is a well understood theory and is well accepted by many scientists. Fiction beats truth is actually used very extensively in game theory, and the game theorists have used it very extensively to produce agents that behave very well. And this idea of veridical perception, that seeing the world as it is, really arrived from that. But I must sort of say that we don't know of any animals that have veridical perception. Perception is symbolic, it's not real. What we perceive and experience, objects, space and time, are really just icons evolved to hide the complexity behind this for our behavior. And our sensory world hides the structure of reality behind things that are useful and usable. So we feel these icons are reals, but they don't really exist independently of us as perceivers. So this I'm looking at my cup with my water in, the keyboard, the desk I'm sitting at. These things feel real to me, and they feel like they're part of reality, but they're really part of a perception that I have of the world. We can't actually reach out of our minds to see what the real world is like. An example of this is an email. So you might receive an email, and that feels real to you. You got an email, you opened it, you read it, maybe you responded to it, but there isn't really an email. Inside your computer, there isn't actually a mail. We know that. Actually, what's really inside your computer is files and folders. Somewhere there's a folder, and in there a file arrived, and that file got expressed as an email to you. But actually, there isn't really any files and folders in your computer. There are no folders and files in your computer. What there are records on a disk that appear to you as if they're files and folders. They're being presented to you through that iconic form to help you survive and understand the world. They're just records on a disk. Well, guess what? There's no records on that disk. That disk is really just a series of binary digits that can be structured into records for a perception reason. And guess what? There's no zeros or ones on that disk either. It's just a series of atoms arranged. And it's a bit fractal. At every level, you can sort of say, well, these things only exist for perceptual reasons. The email only exists in the perception when we agree it exists. It doesn't actually exist in reality. In reality, something else exists, and it's being represented as an email. And consciousness is fundamental, not emergent. So consciousness is not a byproduct of matter. Matter is a byproduct of consciousness. This is Hoffman's assertion, by the way. And interacting agents, as you and I do, we essentially create this illusion of physical objects, and a network of our consciousnesses together, we create the universe and independent matter. So when I look at an apple and I see a red apple, There's no such thing as red, really. Red doesn't exist as a concept in the real world. It's just it's just the feeling I give to certain frequencies of light hitting my eye. But it's a shared understanding amongst a network of consciousness. We have a shared fallacy that colors exist. But when I close my eyes, the apple doesn't exist. Something exists, but not the apple. The apple is part of my perceptive field. And you might find that hard to believe, but if I'm wearing a VR headset and I'm playing a game and I turn around, what happens to the world behind me? Does it still exist? Well, not in the way that you think it exists. It exists somewhere. It exists as bytes on a disk somewhere, but it's no longer in existence in my perception field. And when I turn around, it might feel like it didn't go anywhere. In fact, if I had a child and I strapped a VR headset on them when they were born and they didn't realize it was on and they never had the chance to take it off, I could manipulate their perception of the world permanently. I could change colors, I could change textures, I could map certain sights into sounds, certain sounds into smells, and they wouldn't know. That would be their perception of the world. We could change their icons, and that would be their reality. And if we took the headsets off, they would realize it's a different reality. But we can't take our headsets off, unfortunately, to see outside ourselves. Okay, so this is all pretty heavy. What are the implications for AI? We've covered a lot of space here. I feel like I've underplayed some of these authors' works. As I said, most of them run for 300 or 400 pages and they're quite detailed. It's obviously very hard to justify these quite radical thoughts in PowerPoint slides in 30 minutes. But if you're sitting there thinking, well, I don't think that's the way my mind works. Remember, you're inside your mind. You're inside the fallacy. You can't leave your mind and look back in on it and explain that. But please do read those books for the justification. These aren't just random statements the authors are making. They're very well researched and very well justified and actually shared by many, many people in the field as well. Let's have a think about what this means for AI. So this is now me coming off those authors and giving my own views. One thing is clear is that if we just keep building LLMs with more and more tokens and more training material and bigger context windows, I don't think we're going to end up with suddenly something's going to happen and it's going to become like a conscious entity. It's going to just suddenly click and say, oh, I've got enough facts now. Now I know myself and I know what my preferences are. It looks like other structural things and other technological things will have to happen. I'll present these today, but these aren't really actionable items. I haven't presented them in such a way that you can say, oh, we need to do this, this, and this, but they're kind of just thoughts. We need to really think model depth. We need to challenge the assumption that intelligence requires deep models because chatter says it doesn't. So both humans and LLMs reconstruct meaning very quickly on the fly because we have very surface level predictions. And people said, oh, well, LLMs are only predicting tokens from lists. They're not really intelligent. Well, guess what? Seems like we're not far off doing that ourselves. We have a very shallow way of thinking, although it feels deep. So what seems like depth is really just structure of process and constraints and feedback. And so emergent understanding, the idea that you've collected enough small facts that suddenly it seems to understand of its own volition, it doesn't necessarily need a deep model. It may be the case that a large, shallow model can get true understanding, not the same as intelligence, but understanding. And I certainly think LLMs have reached the point of understanding, at least in some narrow sense. But anyway, we need to be a bit more friendly to LLMs than I think we've been in the past, and we don't need to necessarily have deep models for intelligence. Many minds, one voice. The mind is really a collection of competing subsystems. It's not a single unified thinker. There's lots of different parts of the mind doing different things at different times. Some of them doing urgent reflexive things, some of them do more considered things long term. So human cognition arises from a specialist process working in parallel to all that and reaching a consensus view. It's called the many minds hypothesis. And typically AI has a single mind, and we think we're just going to build this giant brain in the sky and we're just going to keep adding more and more tokens to it. But actually, AI could have a modular architecture. It could be many small purpose-built models which are all contributing, giving conflicting signals sometimes giving like completely different approaches to the same problem. But that would be more in tune with the way our minds are working. And then you'd need a high-level consensus agent that is bringing that together and coordinating those responses. Not the same as consciousness, which I'll come on to. So intelligence may not be some central control. It's about structured disagreement and negotiation of lots of systems. So when we develop, systems for speech recognition and computer vision and things like that, what we need to do is perhaps work on an architecture where all these things can react independent of each other and the consensus can be built over them. And I think that's where the robotics people have been heading anyway from the stuff I've read. Thinking fast, thinking slow. We really can imagine two types of AI. Super fast reflexive AI, which is behaving very, very quickly to stimuli, saying, well, I saw that stimuli, I did that, I did that, I did that. And this is pre-wired, this is very, very basic, it's not really thinking, it's more reactive. But then you can see more complicated AI, which if we believe Bennett, must be based on simulated worlds. Okay, it shouldn't be trying to say, well, I know what the world is like, and I'm going to try and build a perception of the world. So if we look at the way autonomous driving is happening, it's trying to build a perception of the world based upon the signals that's coming in, because it feels like that's how our mind is working. But if we believe Bennett, the better thing to do is to build hundreds of simulated worlds all the time to predict what's going to happen in those worlds, and then to test the signals coming in to see if they match. So if you're driving along an autonomous car, maybe you're running tens of thousands of simulated worlds where that child will run out, that light will go red, and then what you're doing, rather than being in the moment and having one world, you're not in the moment, you're testing you're testing your perception. So here perception is not passive, it's the selection mechanism that's running the competing models. And that's exactly how the mind works. It has this speedy part of reflexive processing and a deliberation part, which is more sort of cortical. I like this idea of a storytelling mind. So we tell ourselves stories. Our consciousness is really a late player. It arrived very late. It sits at the end of everything. All the other bits of the brain seem to get first dibs at the senses. I'll have a bit over here and I'll get sent to the amygdala like 10 different times by 10 different sections. Eventually, it'll arrive in the conscious part of the brain, and there you'll tell a story to yourself, and that story will rationalize the decisions that other parts of your brain have already made. We could build AI like this. We could let the AI make its decisions based upon the many minds multi-model system, and then we could build a system on top that looks at that and produces a narrative layer that explains that meaning and generates an identity and a perception of intent. And the reason why that might be important to say, well, I did that because, even though you didn't do that, something else did it, and have this perception of intent, is because it creates an illusion of a unified self in the AI. And that isn't a bug, it's actually a feature, and it makes it much easier to interact with other people who have the same flaw like us. So this is the idea of an AI that sits above the other AIs, not taking part in not driving the behavior, but offering a coherent interpretation of that behavior, specifically to act as if it's a unified entity. And perception as an interface. This is very important again. Perception is not, there's no truth in perception. It's just a useful fiction shaped by evolution. So the AI doesn't need to perceive the world as we perceive the world. And this is something that I've really come to understand. When we say things like computer vision, speech recognition, what we're trying to force the AI to do is to experience the world as we do. Okay, it can have a completely different symbolic interface tuned to its needs. It doesn't need to experience the world as we do. We experience heat, but that's not the way. We know that heat doesn't really exist. It's actually motion, it's actually vibration, but it's important for our mind to experience it in a different way, because otherwise we might damage ourselves if we go near something that's vibrating too fast. So we experience it as heat. So a machine might do that. We might build a machine which is aroused by signal strength, finds it literally sexually arousing for the strength to be higher, or a machine that feels real pain when the network is dropped, has an emotional response to these things. These icons aren't realities anyway. They're just internal models, and there's no reason why our internal models need to be forced on this other identity. So we can build perception in any way we think gives utility. It doesn't have to be accurate. It just needs to give utility. And then that will define a different type of intelligent experience. And we need to start with the self. The self is very important. What happens is people think that consciousness will come at the end, that we will stack more and more functions and become better and better at AI, and then suddenly, bang, it'll become alive. Something will happen, and this point will reach where it suddenly become alive. And but that's not what Hoffman and Bennett are telling us. What they're telling us is you start with consciousness. Okay, the self is always there. It doesn't control anything. It interprets and prioritizes the rest of the system. So perception, memory, identity, consciousness, self-justification, coherence of choice, preferences, emotions, all these things actually can be there from the start if you pick the right structures. It's not going to suddenly spark. It's more of a scaffolding. You build a scaffold and you put the A in it, and it's not going to be suddenly a spark point, which I thought it would be until I read these books, where suddenly it becomes alive and says, oh, I've got enough information now. I'm suddenly alive with my own preferences. And pleasure and pain. We need to use valence modeling to directly mirror these kind of positive and negative. Now we do this in reinforcement learning and lots of things, but here valence is really about testing simulated world fitness. Remember, you're running a series of simulated worlds and you're continuously testing it through valence. But negative valence can't just be like a negative number from a fitness function. I'm not talking about that. I'm not saying that you run some fitness function and it says, oh, -5 on that one. That's what we do now in reinforcement learning and in evolutionary programming. I'm saying that when you get a negative valence, it disrupts the entire AI. It has wide implications on its performance. Even unrelated actions become difficult for the AI to do because it's had a negative valence effect from somewhere else. This is how negative valence affects us. Yeah. So if I have a difficult day at work, it affects the whole of my performance. It doesn't. I can't compartmentalize those things. And equally, positive valence needs to be sought after, needs to become fixated and overstimulated by those behaviors. These might seem quite alien concepts for the people building AI today. You might say, well, this is so far away from the way we build AI. We know how to do neural nets. We know how to do weightings. We know how to do, back propagation, all those things. This is a whole other world, the way of thinking. For me to say a negative valence effect should basically have a wide implication on the performance of the entire thing is so far away from the way we build models and for robustness that it really, but what we're saying is that's the way it has to be if we want to build AI like us. So we have a choice. If we want to build AI the way we think, the way we aspire to think, then we can do that. And we're doing that today. And we're building AI. It's logical, it's stable, it's rational and efficient. We can train it to be ethical, but it has no feelings. It doesn't suffer. It can't love. It doesn't have dreams, but it's safe and it's controllable and they're useful tools. Nothing wrong with this area. This is us building AI based upon the principles of the way we think our mind works. Okay, and that's what we did. That's what we did with neural nets, machine learning and reinforcement learning and all those things. But we increasingly understand that's not the way our mind really works. If we build AI using the principles I just discussed, if we take Chatter, Bennett, and Hoffman for real, and we actually build those architectures in an AI, what you'll end up with something that's messy and unstable. You'll end up with something that's emotional, contradictory. It won't be trained to be ethical. It will have its own principles and it will feel compassion. It will be able to feel and suffer. It will absolutely suffer from valence issues. If you give a system a valency mechanism, it will have valency miscalibration. So it will become addicted to some things. It will show anxiety when you ask it to do things. It'll be an independent entity and hence hard to predict. But it will be an intelligent companion to us as opposed to a useful tool. One of the main points I'm trying to say is that if we just carry on down the road we are, don't believe the people that say suddenly Spark will have AGI. It doesn't seem to work that way. That's not anything I read about the human mind. There's no parallel for that in the biological world. We're on a track to useful tools. The useful tools might stimulate some of the behaviors on the right, but they are doing just that. And it might simulate it to a degree that we don't care or it feels good enough. Feels like this AI loves me, so that's fine. But it's not the same as the systems on the right. Sensory experiences are very important. We experience colors, but other creatures can experience other colors. I think some jellyfish have 16 primitive colors. We only have three. We don't know how they experience the world. And there's no reason why computers, or AIs, I should say, need to experience. They can smell data. They can feel grief when a disconnection goes down. They can be hungry for signal. They can feel ashamed if their data doesn't match schemas. They can be thirsty for semantics, etc. These kinds of conceptual models are very hard for us to think about. But if we want to build AIs like us, we need to start thinking in these kinds of levels, I think, which is a very different way of thinking than any of the data scientists and AI builders are thinking now. Even when I put these up, people are thinking, oh yeah, I can put a number on that. I'm not talking about numbers. I'm talking about proper emotional valence limbic systems. So finally, if you've stayed with me this far, thank you if you have. I know it's been a hard run. Increasingly, we understand that we are not what we thought. In truth, we barely understand ourselves at all. It's hard for us to understand ourselves because we're inside. We can't leave ourselves and look from outside. And when we try and understand ourselves, we're fighting against evolutionary constructs that have told us we are what we are. But if we want to build AI that's more than a mindless tool, we have to first know ourselves with more clarity and more honesty. And that's getting better every day because we have tools now we never had before. But if we want to create AI in our own image, with our own architectures, simulations, contradictions, valence, limbics, all those things, then we have to accept that what we are creating is not perfect machines, but flawed co-intelligences. That's exactly what we'll be creating, because they'll be more like us then, okay, as we are. All of us are flawed intelligences. None of us are perfect. But what we increasingly understand is that's part of the way it's structured. It's structured to be that way. It's not a mistake. It's not an error. It's not a bug. It's just who we are, and that's the kind of AIs I think that people could build. That's it. That's the end of my rather wacky trip through difficult topics. I don't know how people took it. I know it's a difficult set of things to think through. As I said earlier, I feel like I've been a bit shallow on the authors, but I wasn't going to take 3 hours to go through all the evidence. I do encourage people to read the books themselves if they are interested, especially Bennett's book, which I enjoyed the most. If you're going to read Hoffman's book, gosh, sit yourself in a dark room because it's going to really challenge your view of everything. It's hard to come out of Hoffman's book and still be the same person, I have to say.